History is filled with short-lived nations, those which appeared from nowhere, attempted to forge a place for themselves in the world, and then promptly died. Rhodesia, a mostly unrecognised African nation, was one such example which managed to eke out an existence of 14 years. Which obviously raises the question, why was Rhodesia such a short-lived nation and what happened to it? So, a quick overview. By 1964, South Rhodesia, named after the late 19th century explorer Cecil Rhodes, was a British colony, and the UK government was painfully aware of its empire's coming collapse in Africa. Now, many of Britain's colonies there were administrated by a white minority, and Rhodesia was no different. The London government, under Prime Minister Harold Wilson, said that decolonisation would only be granted on the condition of majority rule. As of 1964, Rhodesia operated on a system of what's called responsible government, which was centred in the city of Salisbury, nowadays called Harare. It had its own Prime Minister and could control its own internal affairs with some British oversight. Its Prime Minister was a man called Ian Smith, who wouldn't grant the franchise based upon race but offered to grant it based upon wealth, which was basically the same thing since the wealth of Rhodesia was almost exclusively controlled by the white minority, which made up 8% of the population. Negotiations over this went nowhere and Smith's government declared independence. Britain immediately petitioned the UN to dissuade other nations from recognising Rhodesian independence, and it also began an economic embargo. And this most notably included an oil embargo and led to Britain implementing a 9-year blockade of a Mozambique port here through which Rhodesia was importing oil. Rhodesia had very few friends, barring some unofficial support from Portugal, hence the oil imports, and South Africa because, obviously. Britain's blockade of this one port was incredibly expensive and also incredibly ineffective because, as it turns out, Africa has more than one port and Rhodesia could simply get oil from South Africa. Whilst international governments denounced Rhodesia's existence as being illegitimate, you should know that British and American public opinion at the time was extremely supportive. So, after the declaration of independence, opposition groups in Rhodesia turned to political violence. At first, the primary opposition was ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which then splintered and was eclipsed by ZANU, which stood for the Zimbabwe African National Union, which was led by a certain Robert Mugabe. ZANU was a communist group which had received training in China as well as equipment and support from the Soviet Union. The Rhodesian government received some support from Portugal, but it was heavily reliant on South African weapons and material. Rhodesia also saw a sizable inward migration from South Africa, as well as receiving veterans from the Vietnam War, mostly Americans and Australians. The ongoing conflict became known as the Bush War, and to put it mildly, it was absolutely brutal. In the early 1970s, the scale of the war increased massively, and despite their small population, the white Rhodesians were able to maintain their hold on the country for 15 years, which, given the embargo and hostile neighbours, was more than most would have expected. However, given the support that the guerrillas were getting, alongside their growing numbers, meant that for Rhodesia, total victory became ever more difficult. Eventually, the defences started to crack, and white civilian deaths increased, which in turn led to emigration to South Africa. Less available families meant less taxes and less soldiers, which meant less ability to safeguard, which led to more emigration. You get the idea. In the end, Smith pushed for a settlement to end the war, but in a way that gave white people in Rhodesia greater authority than their population share would suggest. In the end, he reached what was called the internal settlement with opposition groups, who were led by Abel Muzorewa. The settlement was backed by a whites-only referendum, and in 1979 the first universal election was held, which saw Muzorewa become Prime Minister. And shortly after this, the country was renamed to Zimbabwe-Rhodesia. Mugabe and the other rebels saw this as nothing more than a sham and vowed to keep fighting. Britain refused to accept this election as legitimate, and so Muzorewa met with its government to propose a new transition period. This led to the Lancaster House Agreements, which saw Zimbabwe-Rhodesia revert to British rule briefly until new elections could be held. In 1980, the first internationally recognised general election was held, which saw Mugabe win comfortably. It was shortly after this that Zimbabwe-Rhodesia simply became Zimbabwe, and thus the short-lived minority-ruled nation was no more. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching, with the special thanks to my Patreon supporters who you can see on screen here. And with an extra special thanks to James Bisonet, David Archaeologist, Party Boyko, Danny Maloney, Colin Castleman, Rob Waterhouse, Aaron the White, Michael Reynolds, Urchwayan Emperor, Chris Wicker, Gustav Swan, Gareth Turner, Spinning Three Plates, David Silverman, Winston Kaywood, Maggie Pakskowski, Christian Cheke, Anthony Beckett, Robert Wetzel, Sky Chappelle, and Ike.